The 1950s was certainly a decade in which automotive styling as well as automotive mechanicals really evolved quite significantly. If you take a look as an example at a 1950 Chevrolet that you can see here, that kind of power dome hood, drop fender look is really in a number of ways quite similar to even the pre-war Chevrolet. Take a look here at the 1941 Chevrolet. Obviously different grille and some different elements, but that kind of power dome hood, like I said, with the drop fender look, which was pretty typical at the time, was something that really just mirrored the pre-war styling. Now, as the decade would go on, let's take a look at a 1959 Chevrolet. Clearly, styling evolved pretty significantly, and designers were inspired by the space age and jets and rockets and a number of those things and tried to bring those elements into automotive design. And automotive design, let's say, evolved very significantly from relatively tall and upright vehicles to, by the end of the decade, longer, lower, wider was really the designer's maxim that they employed on most every car. So today what we're going to take a look at and discuss are the top 10 designs of the 1950s. We're going to focus here on just American cars. There were lots of foreign cars during this time frame that really were seminal and were trendsetters from a design standpoint. But for the purposes of my audience, we are going to stick with the top 10 vehicles that, let's say, help shape design and evolve it and are the best looking cars of the 1950s. Let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have the 1958 Pontiac Bonneville. Now, those who are fans of this channel know that I'm not especially fond of the 1958 General Motors vehicles. In particular, the Oldsmobile and the Buick to me just look overwrought and heavy and pudgy, doughy, overly chromed, festooned and bedizened with tons of jewelry. But there are some of the 58s that I actually do kind of like. The 58 Impala to me is not a bad looking design. In fact, it's a good looking car. But if I had to pick one 58 from General Motors in that particular year, I would pick the 58 Pontiac Bonneville. The 58 cars were really interesting in that the designs were fresh. I shouldn't really say fresh. The designs were new for that model year. And then it would be a complete melt and repour of every piece of sheet metal in transitioning from the 58s to 1959. So they were, in effect, just one-year cars. And the Bonneville of the 1958s, I have to say, is my favorite. Now, you have to imagine that a couple years prior to the 58 Bonneville, if you look at 1956 Bonnevilles, you still have the Silver Streak Pontiacs, as people would call them, with those two kind of strakes that ran down the hood. And Pontiac had that for many, many years. And it was just getting old and tired. And Pontiac had a new general manager at this time, Bunky Knudsen, who later would ascend to the vice presidency of General Motors Overseas divisions and then would go to Ford and serve as Ford Motor Company's president when Henry Ford II recruited him. He wanted to change Pontiac from being this kind of old person's brand to something much more exciting. And the 58 Bonneville, to me, really represents a transition between kind of those oldish Pontiac years, 1956 and before, where they were selling older cars for older people or boring cars for boring people, to more sporty vehicles. It's the year before the Y-Track would be introduced in 1959 and also the year before the split grille. But the 58 Bonneville with its wall-to-wall grille, those turn signals protruding from the grille, the quad headlamps, the big scalloped out section on the rear quarter panel that clearly resembles a rocket exhaust, and you have that, I'll call it tip of the spear kind of molding on the side as well that resembles that too. It's just a beautiful mix of autos and space age design. And beyond that, it was pretty technologically sophisticated if you wanted it to be so equipped. More specifically, you could get fuel injection in your 1958 Pontiac Bonneville. And that was a very early setup. There were only a few cars that offered fuel injection at the time. Note that Pontiac wasn't the only one. Of course, Chevrolet did. Chrysler would start offering fuel injection, Bendix-equipped fuel injection on their 300s in 1957. Chevrolet and Pontiac first introduced fuel injection in 1957. So it was about that time. But regardless, the car was just absolutely a fantastic design masterpiece. And the design masterpiece didn't just extend on the outside, but also the interior of these 58 Bonnevilles was quite ornate. You had these dual round kind of gauge pods. One had the gauges, one had the speedometer, then a bunch of more round pods off on the middle section of the IP, as well as the passenger side. This beautiful IP theme that flowed through to the door panels, which was pretty rare at the time. The bright work continued on into the door panels. Beautiful armrests, detailing, and everything. And remember, this is just a Pontiac. But the interior, as I said, looked absolutely fantastic. And for those reasons, that's why I nominate the 58 Bonneville as number 10 on this list. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we have the old school shoebox Ford, the 1950 Ford. Now, the 1950 Ford is obviously a continuation of the 49 Ford. And this particular so-called shoebox series of Fords, or the Ponton designs, were made from 1949 to 1951. And they were so transformational in a number of ways. From a styling perspective, remember I was talking at the front of the video about a lot of cars having that domed hood, dropped headlamp look, and even running boards. Well, the 49 Ford had introduced styling which continued through 1950, where all of that was dropped. The car had extremely clean sides. Some would call it slab-sided. It didn't have that dropped fender look anymore. And it really was just a modern design. Now, what few people know is that the 49 Ford was actually not done in-house by Ford Design at the time. Instead, it was done by an external consultant and his firm, George Walker's firm. And George Walker would later, in the mid-1950s, be hired by Ford and become the vice president of design. But for the 49 Ford, he was not yet a Ford employee. And the design, as I mentioned, for the 49 Fords did not come from an internal source. It came from the external consultants, George Walker and his team, which included such design luminaries as Elwood Engel was an individual who worked for George Walker. Elwood Engel would later go on to become Chrysler's vice president of design after he was passed up for the job once Walker retired. And Joe Oros was also part of George Walker's design team. And Oros would later go on to lead the Mustang design, among other Fords. But in any case, the 1950 Ford, like the model year before, it really was a seminal design in so many ways, as I previously mentioned. And the interesting thing was that not only was it a pretty cool design on the outside and relatively unique, but it also was pretty interesting on the inside. Now, for the 1949 Ford, when it came out, it had a very, very simple one kind of round gauge, if you will, in the middle of the instrument panel that housed basically everything within it. In addition to the speedometer, it had all of the gauges, etc. And that would continue through 1950. This was a very, let's say, unique theme, and also one of the cheapest interiors to produce because everything was contained in that one pod. So it was brilliant and simple at the same time and really made for, I think, something that looked classy and was cost-effective. And as a finance person, well, those are two things that I certainly love. So that's why this is number 9 on the list. Let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have the 1953 Corvette. Now, at number 8, you say you're going to put the 1953 Corvette at number 8? Well, yes, I am. And, well, this is just my perspective. I think that the 53 Corvette is a fantastic looking car in a number of ways. And obviously, it birthed the Corvette. It's the inaugural year for the Corvette. So it has a lot of historical significance and a lot of great design elements. Those rocket-like tail lamps that kind of just organically flow out of the quarter panel to the front end, and the very smooth surfacing and sculpture. There's not really hardly any creases on this car, so to speak of. The body sides, as well as the front and the rear, are largely rounded forms, and this entire car is very rounded in general, from the wraparound windscreen, as I mentioned, to the sheet metal, to even this beautiful waterfall in between the front driver and passenger seat. So the Corvette had a number of beautiful design elements associated with it. Now, while the styling is certainly beautiful on the 1953 Corvette, and this was the car that gave birth to an automotive icon, I don't know that I would exactly call the styling of the car revolutionary or controversial or overly trend-setting. It really was just a good-looking car that had some, nice, let's say, styling elements that I mentioned, but a lot of the styling elements and the overall design and the proportions, I would say, had really been pioneered by other vehicles before the Corvette. The Corvette just really executed them well and did so for the first time from an American standpoint. And I think that's what made it so successful. There were certainly some interesting styling elements. The grids over the headlamps, the license plate enclosed under a glass frame, the exhaust coming through the rear, which was done on other cars as well. The twin cockpit theme with the similar look in front of the driver as well as the passenger, although, of course, the passenger didn't get any gauges. So suffice it to say, the Corvette was a great-looking car, but wasn't necessarily the biggest style leader of the time. It was certainly one of Harley Earl's final, let's say, vehicles that he did that was extremely successful. He would retire after the 1958 model year cars were done. But this Corvette, while I said it has a lot of great styling elements, I don't think it necessarily deserves to be higher up on the list, but you can let me know in the comment section. And while it was a beautiful styling exercise, it would take Chevrolet a few model years to really get the Corvette the power that it deserved when it finally dropped a V8 into the Corvette in 1955. For those who don't know, 1953 and 1954, you got the Blue Flame 6 under hood, which wasn't all that peppy, made it to a Power Glide in 1953. So 2-speed automatic with a 6-cylinder engine under hood wasn't a terrible performer for the time. Just didn't have the power, like I said, that it deserved, which it finally got in 1955. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have the 1957 Ford Thunderbird. Yes, I did put the Thunderbird ahead of the Corvette, despite the fact that the Thunderbird, really in its 2-passenger form, would just last from 1955 to 1957. Before in 1958, it became a 4-place car, which made it hugely more successful. But that 1958 Thunderbird, I think it's a good looker. I don't know that it necessarily should make this list. To me, the 57 Thunderbird is really the ultimate 2-place Thunderbird and maybe the ultimate Thunderbird overall. As I said, this car was not as big of an automotive icon as the Corvette, but I think the 57 Thunderbird really hits the mark in a number of ways for me. That gaping mouth grille with the fine kind of square-like egg crate texture up front, the protruding headlamps, the hood scoop, the rear fin that is kind of canted at an angle. It just all works together. And of course, on the removable hardtop, the porthole window, which would become a design signature not only for the Thunderbird, but something that even Chrysler would rob on the TC by Maserati in the 1980s and 1990s. Of course, on your TC by Maserati, the issue there was that they had a little Maserati Chrysler logo in the porthole, and it ended up burning the carpet if you didn't have a piece of kind of tint behind it, or you had a particular glass that was cut in a certain incorrect way. There was no logo here, and the glass wasn't cut in the wrong direction on the Ford, so there was no issue there. But the 57 Thunderbird, like I said, I think was just a beautiful styling exercise that while it was not overly successful, and it really took the 58 Thunderbird to be the most successful, I just think whether you look at this car from the front or the rear, it looks fantastic. I love the 57 because of the canted fins at the back, as opposed to the ones that were just straight up and down, the exhaust coming through the bumper, the very simple forms, but you also have various creases. It's not like the Corvette that's entirely round. Those fins come to a very nice and distinct point, which puts some tension in the rear three-quarter view of the vehicle. And then, of course, you have a similar tension by, I'll call it relatively sharp headlamp surround edges up at the front of the car, too. So it's a great-looking car and one that I think certainly deserves to be on this list. And you really had some power under hood in your 57 Thunderbird. You get up to 300 horsepower with a supercharged 312 cubic inch V8. Chevrolet was making headlines with its 1 horsepower per cubic inch, 283 horsepower 283 cubic inch V8. But like I said, you get up to 300 horsepower with a supercharged 312 V8, and the regular 312 made 245 horsepower. The only thing about these Thunderbirds is they're kind of fun to drive, but if you're relatively tall, you don't fit that well in them. I'll just say that. And they're not as rewarding as some of the later cars. But again, a good looker. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, I have the 1959 Buick. Now, of the 1959 General Motors cars, it's honestly really tough to pick ones that are not good looking. They all look good. I already showed the 1959 Chevrolet. There was the 59 Pontiac, which was also a looker. The 59 Olds was beautiful. And there might be another 59 General Motors car that's coming up a little bit further up on the list here. But the 59 Buick for me is one that's fantastic looking and also one that's really not that well known. I mean, what other car do you have? This beautiful power dome hood, the cufflink, I'll call it textured grille, which by the way was a carryover of the 1958. Then you have this beautiful V-like form and canted headlamps, and that V form not only forms the top of the fender, but that continues on to this body side crease, kind of a diving line that goes down on the vehicle as it progresses rearward. And then additionally, you have a new line that starts up near the front door and forms another fin that's canted and continues all the way through the rear. A absolutely fantastic looking car, and such a dramatic improvement over the 58 Buick, despite the fact that it has some similar features, as I mentioned, like that cufflink texture grille. Now, while the front of the car is certainly dramatic, the rear of the 59 Buicks is as well. You have, as I mentioned, those fins that just are beautifully canted and executed, and it just sweeps down. You can see the deck lid cut line makes these fins look enormous as well. The two tail lamps, rocket-style tail lamps or jet engine tail lamps and exhaust. And, of course, the interior on these Buicks was also fantastic. I can't really say much bad about the 1959 GM interiors, no matter which one that you pick. But I love the Buick with not only the speedometer, but kind of this unorthodox. You have that horizontal rolling drum speedometer, and then you've got these two pods underneath it, and then two smaller pods flanking it. It's just a beautiful looking dash and interior. So the 59 Buick for me is one of the pinnacles of General Motors design of all time. The 1960 Buick is also a beautiful car, but obviously that's in the 1960s and not in the 50s, so I couldn't pick it. I don't know which one I like better, the 59 or the 60. I might err a little bit toward the 60, maybe, just maybe, because it's got the cool rolling drum mirror speedometer too, and I think the interior is even a little more wonky than the 59, but they're both absolutely fantastic looking cars, and two of my favorites overall, although I don't own one. I've never been able to find one that was in good enough shape. I'd have to have an Electra, have to be a coupe, just because that's what I would want. So if anybody's got one out there, let me know. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have the Continental Mark II. Now, notice I said the Continental Mark II, not the Lincoln Continental Mark II, because the Continental Mark II was produced by the Continental division of Ford. This was a time during which I think Ford was a little bit jealous of General Motors' 5 brand strategy, and it only had Ford, Mercury, and Lincoln, and they ended up adding the Continental division in 1956, and then added the Edsel division in 1958. Unfortunately, both were extremely short-lived, and the Continental Mark II would only be produced in 1956 through 1957. The car was designed to really be a Rolls-Royce competitor, and this was a time frame during which Cadillac and Lincoln were both really trying to push the upper end of the price spectrum and the upper end of the luxury spectrum. Cadillac had the Eldorado Brougham that came out in 1957, and Lincoln, of course, as I mentioned, had the Continental Mark II that was a $10,000 car, an extremely expensive automobile. That'd be over $100,000 base price today if you adjusted for inflation. Now, for that, you got a tastefully understated, reserved, and elegant car. Remember, Cadillacs during this time frame had big chrome bumpers with pointy ends on them, fins out back, and the Lincoln was really the antithesis of that. It was just tasteful and understated and elegant with this dramatic kind of vertical, almost C-pillar, these headlamps that protruded from the front area of the car, a big grille, very small tail lamps out back. You had the trunk with the hump on it that would become a hallmark of Continentals. Here it was actually functional because that was where the spare tire was placed. On the subsequent Continentals, it was just a dummy hump. The spare tire wasn't placed there. But whether you think inside or out, the Continental Mark II was really just a extremely well-appointed and luxurious automobile, but it was not one that was overly showy or flashy. This was the car that you drove if you wanted to arrive and make a statement, but not do so by really showing off and kind of rubbing salt on others' wounds that they didn't have the money that you did. It was an elegant car, and like I said, it had so many cool features associated with it, including the fuel filler, which was found behind the driver's side tail lamp. Now, on the inside, it's amazing because the car really doesn't have all that much in terms of ostentatious style. It's got this very kind of reserved, I would say, gauge package in front of the driver. Did use absolutely top-of-the-line materials, including Bridge of Weir leather inside, but the whole car is just reserved and classy. And of course, this gave birth to the whole Continental series of vehicles, the Mark III, Mark IV, Mark V. Interestingly, the Mark III, there really are two Continental Mark IIIs, the 1958 and the 1969. There was a Mark III in 1958, a Mark IV in 1959, a Mark V in 1960. But Lincoln chose to disregard those when they introduced the Mark III for 69 because the Mark III really was the continuation of this particular vehicle, not that 58 Mark III. As I mentioned, the Continental division would be short-lived, as was the Continental itself. And so Ford's kind of attempt to go for that five-brand strategy just never quite worked out, but it was worth them trying. Let's move on now to number 4. At number 4, we have an iconic vehicle of the 1950s. That is the 1957 Chevrolet. The Tri-5 Chevrolets, the 55, 56, 57, are some of the most iconic 1950s era cars. But I picked the 57 because it has the trademark rear, those fins that really are unmistakable. The 55 and 6 are great-looking vehicles, but a little bit understated. Of the 5 and the 6, I have to say the 56 is my favorite because of the wall-to-wall grille up front. These vehicles were designed by Claire McKeegan, who was Chevrolet's chief designer starting in 1953, and he would continue on through about 1962. He would later go on to Opel and would champion a number of Opel designs there, then come back to General Motors stateside after several years overseas. And the Tri-5 Chevrolets are just classic in so many ways, but also pretty, I would say, clean pieces of style. I do like the little dip in the belt line that they all have. Of course, the fins that I mentioned on the 57, the grille that resembles in the front end, that resembles a little bit of a Cadillac. And that was something that Chevrolet was trying to do for many years, was emulate Cadillac. And they would continue to do so for years thereafter. Now, out back, you also had a pretty tall deck lid because Chevrolet had a design criteria that the trunk had to hold those, I think they're 40-liter milk jugs, had to be able to hold those standing upright because farmers would use their Chevrolets and bought plenty of them. So that was one of the reasons why the car had such a tall deck lid. It does also have a concealed fuel filler in the driver's side fin, kind of similar to the Continental that I mentioned before. But the 57 Chevrolet was just a beautiful looking car for an entry car especially. It did have a great ride. They had the, I think, quadrupoise ride is what they called it. Very level over bumps. It didn't have a lot of squat or dive upon braking. Had great suspension geometry in general. And of course, you had the Chevrolet small block under hood, which by 57 was 283 cubic inches, and you could get it with 283 horsepower if you went for the fuel-injected variant. 1 horsepower per cubic inch. So for those reasons, I've included the 57 Chevrolet here. Now let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we have the 1957 Plymouth Fury. Now, in 1957, Chrysler really set the industry on its heels by introducing an entirely new series of vehicles, the so-called forward-look Chryslers. And across the entire lineup, the Chryslers were all new and beautiful, all had these super tall fins, generally had thin roofs. Plymouth Fury, though, of all of them, was really the one that I think was just the style icon. That's because it was part of the low price three, Plymouth Ford and Chevrolet were the low price three, and the Plymouth looked the best, I think, of all of them for 1957. Although the Chevrolet, as I just mentioned, and the Ford looked great too. But the Plymouth just took the styling in an entirely new direction. And it was so ahead of its time. The ad campaign that Plymouth used for the 57s was Suddenly It's 1960. And, well, it really was. It was an advancement in styling in so many ways. I love how Plymouth even came up with this way to make the front end of the car look like it had quad headlamps. The inner lamps are just turn signals because not all states allowed 4 headlamps at this point. That wasn't until 1958. But the car was just a beautiful styling exercise done by Virgil Exner and his team. There's not much that looks bad about this Plymouth. I love the roofline, love the front windshield, love the fins, love the gold anodized trim out back. I like how the fins are canted as well. And then up front, maybe the only thing I could criticize is the front bumper looks a little chunky. But I guess they were trying to emphasize safety as well as just style to prove that the car wasn't just all about styling. And even on the inside, the Chryslers of this era look absolutely fantastic I love the kind of, rounded off corners, but a square-like gauge pod. The steering wheel's beautiful. The interior is beautiful. Unfortunately, the Achilles heel of the 57 Plymouths and the Chryslers that came out for 1957 was the quality. They rusted early. They didn't have inner fender liners in front of the wheels, so snow and debris would pack itself behind the headlamps and then rust out the fenders up top. This was the first year for the torsion bar ride up front and the leaf spring rear. And I don't think Chrysler quite got it right. And in general, the quality of these cars wasn't that great. And the result was that while 57 was a banner year for Plymouth, it had dropped significantly in market share just a couple of years later because customers had so many quality issues with their car. So while it was undeniably a style icon, it did certainly have some issues, and that was something that didn't endear it to its customers. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2 is the 1959 Cadillac. Now, the 1959 Cadillac wouldn't have happened without that 1957 Plymouth and the 1957 Chrysler lineup. General Motors wasn't going to let Chrysler outdo itself with fins. And so the Cadillac designers penned this beautiful car that was the supreme development of the fin for 1959 with this gorgeous kind of rocket-like form on the tail lamp treatment. And it just was so well integrated into the fin. But the fin almost looks cartoonish in terms of its overall height. Now, the 59 Cadillac was, I would say, the style icon for GM in 1959. The whole lineup was quite good, as I mentioned before, and I obviously had the Buick on this list. But the Cadillac is the one that everybody really remembers, and if you drive one of these down the street, somebody is going to certainly smile because how can you not love, especially that rear three-quarter view? The front view is a little chunky, in my opinion, the bumper in particular, and the way that the turn signals are done. That would get toned down for 1960, and I think the car overall would look a little bit better for 1960. But the 59 is really the iconic one because, as I said, of that rear view. Now, the car was powered by Cadillac's 390 cubic inch V8, made good power, was mated to the high dramatic 4-speed automatic, had good quality, was durable, reliable. So in addition to the looks, you had a reliable vehicle overall. But beyond that, you really arrived in style in your 1959 Cadillac. Now for number 1. What is the best-looking car, in my opinion, of the 1950s? Well, it would have to be the 1953 Studebaker Starliner hardtop. And the 1953 Studebaker, in so many ways, is really a seminal vehicle, the seminal car of the 50s. You have to put this car in context of what other cars looked like in 1953. Look at how low the cowl is and the hood height and how it tapers so beautifully in the front as well as the rear. this was just not something that was done on cars really in the early 1950s, at least American cars. I mean, look as an example at a 1953 Chevrolet. It's very tall and upright. We talked about the shoebox Ford before, tall and upright. And the 53 Studebaker just looked like it came from a different decade. You've got that beautifully tapered hood, low cowl height. It was so low, the Studebaker engineers actually had to design a different air cleaner assembly for their engines that put the air cleaners off to the side so that they could clear the hood. And then you have this twin-port grille before Pontiac had it in 1959. But I wonder if they got a little bit of inspiration from the 53 Studebaker. Then out back, you've got this beautifully tapered rear as well. And the bumpers it's a multi-piece bumper. The Studebaker designers really wanted a single piece, but the manufacturers just couldn't quite figure out how to do that in a cost-effective manner. But imagine if this bumper was a single piece, how beautiful the back would look as well. Now, the one thing about the 53 Studebakers, unfortunately, is that just like the 57 Chryslers, the build quality, and beyond the build quality, the engineering wasn't all that great. These had very flexible chassis in 1953, too flexible, really, for what they should have had. As a result, the car looked beautiful, but it was kind of, I'll say, less than a rewarding driving experience. But regardless of that, the 53 Studebaker set so many styling trends. It really was a car that, remember I talked about lower, longer, wider? Well, here it is in the 53 Studebaker. In fact, the coupes rode atop a longer wheelbase than the four-door Studebakers for 1953, just to get the overall proportion right. So the cars were lower, they were longer, and they also were wider. And just unfortunately for Studebaker, they didn't drive all that well compared to some of the competition. But this car, in my opinion, is the best-looking car of the 50s, and certainly the style leader that really set so many trends. Well, what do you think of my list? Did I miss anything? Put a comment in the comment section, and did I get the order right? Let me know. Thanks again for watching.